good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this STARS webinar. I'm Tony Schönenberger. I'm the Executive Chairman of STARS. STARS is actually a platform for dialogue for business leaders to discuss developments which will impact our society as a whole, but particularly also our businesses in the next couple of years. Today, we have the great privilege to talk to Drew THOMPSON. Drew, welcome. Good to have you on this webinar.
Thank you, Tony.
Drew is a visiting senior research fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore. From 2011 to 2018, he was the director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in the Office of the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Drew is, I would say, really an old China hand. He lived in Shanghai from 1993 to 1998, and he studied Chinese language at the Beijing University. And I'm particularly proud and pleased that he will be one of our speakers at the upcoming STARS Singapore Symposium in June of next year. We have a couple of housekeeping rules. We have now 30 minutes to discuss with Drew. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. And I would like to encourage all of you to do it as quickly as possible because we are running out of time very fast. So let's start. Drew, obviously the first question should focus on China. We all know Xi Jinping had been re-elected a couple of months ago, but recently we have seen an increasing opposition against the zero COVID strategy. Are we seeing the beginning of an exit strategy regarding COVID-19?
So I think China is definitely adapting to significant societal pushback and the economic impact of its current COVID approach, but it faces a number of challenges. I think one of the key challenges it faces, and this is not specific to COVID, but really a feature of China's governance system, is the inability of the central government to control the actions and behaviors of individual cadre at the very local level. So in some cases, you have overreaction, over-application, or disregard for guidance from the central government, which is a feature of Chinese governance that's been a challenge virtually throughout its history. So from a more, shall we say, scientific point of view, there's a number of just very fundamental challenges. China's vaccine rates or vaccination rates are very low compared to other countries, particularly here in Singapore by comparison. The effectiveness of China's homegrown vaccines are not as good as the Western ones, which presents a higher degree of risk for the Chinese population. And the healthcare system has really resisted effective reforms for the last 20 years and is somewhat decrepit. It is very profit-driven rather than public health-driven, and it's underfunded. So the average out-of-pocket expenses for Chinese people are quite high, which leads to societal problems in terms of accessing healthcare. So there's a real risk that despite the protests that took place across China last week about COVID implementation, there's a real risk that if the measures are removed and if COVID spreads much more widely, that there will be high levels of infection. And even if deaths are not high, there's certainly going to be a rush to hospitals that threatens to overwhelm it. And if the medical system becomes overwhelmed, then that will also lead to dissatisfaction and potentially localized protests. So in a way, Xi Jinping faces a real dilemma. He can have protests and suppress them as best as possible, or he can address the underlying causes of the protest and ease the COVID restrictions, but then he probably has a collapsed healthcare system to contend with, which might lead to protests again. So Xi Jinping's in a tough position, and I don't envy him. But that said, I think there is recognition that the current model can't be sustained indefinitely, and that they're going to have to expand vaccination and shore up hospitals as much as possible.
So in addition to that, obviously, because of the COVID strategy, the economy as a whole is down, a growth rate of approximately 3% or so. Would you go that far and say there is a kind of a system crisis in China?
So there's definitely a concurrence of multiple crises occurring at once. And I think some of these challenges are things that Xi Jinping can control. And I think there are some things that he cannot. So for instance, the inability to control local officials is really something that cannot be addressed in China's current political structure. The economic and social issues can potentially be reversed. But again, the central government just really struggles to address the underlying problems and instead tends to focus on the symptoms. So yes, definitely we're likely facing a global recession, and most importantly, the decline of consumption of consumer products around the world, particularly in the US and Europe, and that's going to hurt Chinese exports. You have the risk of capital flight from China and declining foreign direct investment. You have bigger underlying issues that, again, are very difficult to address, including demographic decline, an underfunded social security system that's going to accompany an aging population. I mean, these are going to be headwinds that China has to face, in addition to these short-term crises of confidence in the government and a rickety healthcare system. So I think there's been some mismanagement of the economy that really predates COVID, overinvestment on infrastructure for GDP growth, for economic growth, instead of driving consumption. Instead of focusing on services. And this is partly a function of the way the party has really taken control of the economy and businesses. So these are all underlying major challenges, but at the same time, I think China does have many tools and resources to manage them, though it's unlikely that they'll be able to or willing to accept the risk that would come with a wholesale reform. So they'll continue to deal with the symptoms of these systemic problems that China's had to deal with for 30 years, if not more. But the reality is they are probably not going to change the system to increase resilience. They'll simply continue to invest in the ability to mitigate.
Has China's global power reached its peak? I mean, seeing the less attractiveness for investors, expats leaving China, there is a brain drain, I believe. Are we approaching a new era?
Well, I mean, I think Xi Jinping would probably disagree that we've seen peak China. I think Xi Jinping's approach and his objective of the China dream of great national rejuvenation is still very achievable. But unquestionably, China is fragile, and there are questions about the sustainability and the pace of its future development. But I think there's one big factor that really needs to be considered as you evaluate China's near future and really what it means for foreign businesses and interests and many of the members of STARS. And I think you mentioned the new era, and that really underscores the nature of governance that's changed in China since 2012 when Xi Jinping came to power and became the general secretary of the party. They call it a new era. And I think in hindsight, it's fairly clear how much has changed. But I think companies, governments in particular, have been really slow to recognize the extent and the implications of those changes. And again, I think the biggest meta change is the role of the party in all aspects of society, economy, and the government as well, right? Xi Jinping's favorite saying, right? The party leads in all things, north, south, east, and west. That includes the elimination of civil society, which has effectively disappeared, independent civil society. And that has implications for foreign investors and overseas interests. The other major change with the party's increasing control over government is that essentially the government no longer makes policy, the party does. And the government is the implementing organ. And as a result, that creates a layer of distance between marginally accessible government authorities for private businesses, foreign and local, and makes it much, much harder for business interests, private sector to really influence policy making to create a favorable investment environment and business environment that they can thrive in. So I think it's not just a question of whether China has peaked or not, but I think these are key political risks that have increased. And whether or not they've peaked or whether they're still going to increase, I think is an open question. We clearly have at least 10 more years of Xi Jinping ahead of us. And the question is, how much more are these risks going to increase? And I point out that the party's perception of risks on their side is also quite acute. The party is very quick to respond to the perceived risks that they see, both internal and external. The party really assesses that external threats exacerbate and catalyze internal threats and risks. And I think all of these risks potentially threaten the party, and they call that political risks. It's a catch-all category of risks to the party. And this has real significant implications for private companies. And I think companies, as they operate in China, if they threaten the party in some way, they'll suffer. And if you consider what happened to Ant Financial, other tech companies, private education companies, those are some obvious recent cases where by the nature of their business, they perhaps control data or information about the general public in China or about the government that potentially threatens it. And as a result, their businesses have dramatically declined. And I think the other major problem that presents a major risk and that is unlikely to have peaked is the lack of a transparent and structured policymaking process in China. You have essentially the party running commissions and leading small groups that make all the major decisions, but even their membership is secret. So this makes private companies and foreign investors really at a tremendous disadvantage when operating in China. They're effectively silent partners in China's economy. The last risk that I'll highlight, since I'm on this theme, is that really the consolidation of power in Xi Jinping's hands really brings its own degree and level and types of risks. You potentially, with Xi Jinping as the sole power source within the party, you potentially have unpredictable and arbitrary decision-making processes that could be based on either the party's sense of security rather than other rationales such as economic growth or high rates of economic growth. You potentially have greater inefficiencies and things like the desire to sort of reform and open the economy more, integrate more with other economies could be seen as a threat, could be seen as a risk to the party, and therefore is unlikely to proceed. So you have potentially diverging interests between the private sector and Xi Jinping himself and his perception of what threatens the party. And I think lastly, you have a pretty significant risk of Xi Jinping's personal interest diverging from those of other stakeholders in the system. And lastly, perhaps the mother of all political risks in China is the lack of an identified next generation leader, and with it, the lack of a rules-based succession process. So how that would occur if it happens particularly unexpectedly is a major political risk that we really can't predict. So it's not a question of whether or not China has peaked. It's really a question of whether or not foreign engagement with China has peaked, and it may have.
In this context, Drew, and looking at all these political risks, particularly, to be more concrete, if you were the CEO or the chairman of BASF or of Volkswagen or Mercedes or BMW, what would you do?
Well, I think what I would do is I would start a process. I would start a process to look at these factors and look at these potential risks and what it means for each individual company or their industry. I think that the trick to political risk analysis, it's a bit like Marxism. It's not just an ideology, but it's really a process. And it's a way of looking at systematically what are the potential risks to the company, not the big broad geopolitical risks like climate change, which certainly would have an impact, but the more specific ones, such as the taxation that would be imposed on emissions in a particular country, for example, to use the climate change analogy, or the risk of political challenges to technology, or the risk of partners perhaps having conflicts of interest, and basically do a complete taxonomy of what the risks those companies face, and then begin a process of deciding how to manage that. And that could be a process of considering what's the corporate tolerance for that risk. Is it a question of the profits and the rewards are perceived to be so high, in which case higher risk tolerance is there, and then the question is, what can be done to mitigate and reduce those risks? How can those risks be smoothed over time or over partners? So by bringing in other partners, by bringing in other Chinese partners, by considering the division of equity in key joint ventures, rethinking strategies for companies, whether they want to be producing independently in a wholly owned, wholly invested company or in a joint venture with partners, which is the best structure for the existing political environment. And then ultimately developing some really long-term goals and how those risks affect those long-term goals. I mean, the most important thing is what does the company want to achieve? Do they want to stay at any cost, or do they want to consider whether divestiture is an option? That could be shifting from an equity stake to maybe a licensing stake, where the company is still involved in production processes and providing components and precursors to a process, but perhaps not owning the equity in the factory itself, in the property. So I think these are all sort of options that that companies have to maybe start a process of considering. And the thing to remember is that risk is really an equation, and it's probability times the impact, right? So identifying what risks have the greatest likelihood of occurring under Xi Jinping and which ones would be the greatest impact to the firm. And I think that's the most important thing. You can't compare Volkswagen to BASF. They're going to be different in terms of the products, the industry, policies directed towards it. There may be some consistent risks. As I said, carbon taxes will certainly be consistent, and being able to buy into carbon trading regimes, for example, those will be common between companies. But I think those industries aren't all going to face the same risk, and that's the same for the firms. So I think they need to identify them, and then they need to really manage them, and that could be avoiding them, transferring that risk to a partner. Mitigating them, in other words, reducing their likelihood through government engagement, and deciding what's their level of acceptance. So I think there will be some scenarios where there will be a sweet spot in that probability times impact matrix, where they can continue to operate, but then figure out how do you reduce the risk. And I think that's a core function for any government relations team in a company. And it's the process that probably matters more than the advice that comes out of it. It's a collective process. It's not just hiring a consultant to give you a report and say, these are the risks you face. It's really the staff and the teammates within different parts of the company coming together in a managed process to identify objectives, determine how the company can identify and engage stakeholders to shape that political environment, and then operate in it so it remains favorable to them. So that's a rather complex answer. It's not as simple as divest and get out of Dodge, or hedge your bets and invest in Vietnam and in a China plus one strategy. It's really about basically reproducing the processes that companies often do when they enter a market, and they'll do due diligence and decide the risk going into a market. It's less common for companies to spend time once they're in a market to really reassess those risks and then decide how do they shape their business strategies. So that would be my advice to the list of companies you provided.
Great. There is actually a question from Christoph Lindenmeyer. He is asking, if you were a medtech company like Johnson & Johnson, what would you do in China in light of the VBP auctions, which lead to enforced prices, which global companies cannot cope with?
So, I mean, that's hardly a new problem, and it is a fundamental risk in China, where your basically sole or major client is the government and the government purchasing process, and the lack of a private sector within the healthcare enterprise really disadvantages foreign pharmaceutical companies. Price negotiations with China have always been a zero-sum endeavor, and there's really no good way around it. The only solution really would be a rather confrontational one, and that I think would be a cartel, where essentially pharmaceutical companies band together and try to impose some pricing regime that is acceptable to them and limits China's downward negotiating leverage. The problem is China likes to threaten to throw those companies out, but at the same time, there is a high demand for those foreign pharmaceuticals that aren't made in China, or that are made in China but not accessible elsewhere. And the big challenge is, they have to provide them to their people, and they have to provide them at a reasonable price. But the Chinese government, for them, the reasonable price is at the absolute lowest level, preferably even, compelling companies to provide subsidies and developing market level prices, even though China is hardly a developing market anymore. So there's no good way to manage this, but it's a price of entering the market. But really, the best thing they can do is band together, deal with corruption in the healthcare sector, which is not often discussed, but part of an underlying problem. Unfortunately, doctors are not paid well, and they're incentivized to prescribe drugs and medical tests, both to support the hospital's income, but it creates perverse incentives, and that doesn't lead to good patient outcomes. And that's a systemic problem, and why there's such dissatisfaction with the healthcare system, because patients don't trust doctors. Doctors don't have their best interest at heart. They have their own interest at heart and their hospital's interest at heart. And it really gets to the very basis of service provision. And again, this is not a new problem. This is something China's been dealing with since the reform and opening period began in 1979, and they've yet to resolve it. So no good answers, I'm afraid. But if companies are committed to China, unwilling to leave, unwilling to use whatever leverage they have, then they'll continue to face this downward price setting pressure from the government, because they feel that they do have the monopoly on purchases. The alternative is for those manufacturing properties in China to export and take advantage of the manufacturing base to supply other markets, and leave China with less supply, and asking themselves, why do they have such an adversarial relationship with pharmaceutical companies when it's really not necessary if they would have reasonable pricing schemes?
Another question from Doris Albisner. What perspectives and risks may SMEs face in the current political and economic climate in China? Are they comparable to the ones you just illustrated for larger corporates?
So in some ways, SMEs, particularly the small enterprises, really don't have the resources and the bandwidth to address political risk the same way a large company would. So in some ways, they are essentially floating along the river, following the tide of trends that affect industries. But that said, there are tools that they can use, including joining industry associations, chambers of commerce, and teaming up with other small, medium enterprises in the same industry to seek either efficiencies or common positions and leverage strength in numbers to affect better outcomes. But small and medium enterprises have really struggled in China in the last several years, not just from COVID, which I think has hit them very, very hard because of declining consumption and just the general declining economy. But I think it's also been a consistent trend where the state sector has taken a larger and larger role in China's effectively their economic planning, leaving the private sector struggling to catch up despite their higher efficiencies. And again, for foreign invested SMEs, it's really a question of how committed one is to the market, how high their risk tolerances are, and whether the perceived and potential benefits will outweigh the risks.
I would like to turn to the US-China relationship. At the G20 meeting in Bali, there was a long, I believe it was a long meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. And I got the impression that the relationship seemed to slightly improve, at least. How would you describe the US-China relationship right now?
So, I mean, yes, that G20 meeting went 3 hours, apparently. Though I question whether the relationship is fundamentally improved, though I think the tone of China's interactions with not just the US, but several other countries has certainly shifted at the G20. But honestly, I'm not terribly optimistic about the near-term future of US-China relations, because I think partly because many of the forces that previously pulled the two sides together are really no longer defining factors of the bilateral relationship. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the parties' clear priority is political security, not economic development, and that's a significant change from the Deng Xiaoping era, where China made a conscious decision to accept the risks of ideological risks to their economy. So foreign investment in the presence of foreigners was a very necessary risk beginning in '79 that simply no longer deemed an acceptable risk in 2022. The foreign policy approach that China is currently conducting is very maximalist. As I said, it perceives threats everywhere. There's a big revival of Marxist ideology and thinking and process in Chinese government processes, essentially making Chinese cadres see the world in very adversarial terms, just as Marxism does, labor versus capital, superstructure versus base. And the result is a government that's increasingly told by the party to prepare for struggle and challenges, not least with the United States. So China's also engaged as part of this maximalist approach, what I would call list diplomacy, presenting lists of wrongdoings to foreign partners and telling them that they must do certain things to improve relations. And the problem with this approach is that it really lacks the reassurances to accompany that deterrence. It's just not clear what China would do if another country would take all of these items on a list and enact them, basically suborning their own interest to China's. How would the relationship change? What would China do differently if the US or Australia or Japan or other countries would do what China said was wrong? If they were to do things differently and accommodate China's interests, it's completely unclear. So without that reassurance, I think China's efforts to deter the US and other countries is largely going to fail. Smaller countries is a different issue. From Washington's perspective, I think Washington is really responding to the changes that are taking place in China. I mean, they're adapting to the new era that you mentioned earlier under Xi Jinping. Clearly, there's a bipartisan consensus in Washington that engagement with China has been largely unsuccessful. And I think there's a perception that there's very little to gain from China engaging China, and they have much to lose should China gain greater economic leverage over the US. So I think China presents the US as having this sort of innate desire to contain China or prevent its rise. And I don't think that's true. It's kind of it's a trope, right? You can call it the Thucydides trope, right? That US is doing whatever it can to prevent China from becoming the greatest power in Asia. And I think it's really a gross misstatement of what the US interests are and what its motivations are. Again, Washington is very discouraged from engaging China because they're resigned to gaining few benefits. And there are a couple of underlying structural reasons for that. I mean, China has these strategies such as the dual circulation strategy, right, which really aims to make China's economy really resilient and less dependent on foreign economies, and gaining whatever benefits they can from those foreign economies, like technology, but really making those foreign economies dependent on China. which then would give China political and economic leverage and essentially very significant coercive power. You also have fairly consistent import substitution regimes, such as Made in China 2025, which really aims to displace foreign companies from China's market in critical sectors. And then you have other security challenges like the civil military integration program, which is a really major disincentive for economic engagement because it's effectively weaponizing China's economy to support its military. So there's reports, I think, in Bloomberg today that China is willing to work with the U.S. to manage end user concerns so that commercial technology isn't provided to China and then transferred to the PLA, giving the U.S. Effectively an assurance. And it'll be interesting to see how those talks continue, because that would be addressing one of the major concerns. And I think a key rationale for why the U.S. restricts technology sales and seeks to coerce U.S. partners to restrict technology sales to China as well. But I think it's really hard to argue to Washington that there's an upside to expanding engagement, particularly economic engagement in China, when this is the policy framework that defines the playing field. I mean, granted, it's a big consumer market, it's got great potential, but I mean, there's tremendous risks entering it, and not least of which is the role of the party in all aspects of society and government. And it's not just the regulator, but the owner of companies in the market as well. So I think the biggest factor that would pull the US and China together is really mutual economic benefits. But instead, I think we're seeing very divergent economic interests emerging. So today, the primary objective of US engagement with China is really risk management or risk reduction. It's establishing these guardrails, as the administration calls it, to prevent the relationship from spiraling into real confrontation. So Washington instead is very sensibly focused on improving itself so it can compete more effectively. And that's making long overdue investments in infrastructure, supply chain resilience, multilateral standard setting, and things like the Trans-Pacific Economic Framework, as well as enhancing its own military capabilities and alliances so that it can deter the use of force in Asia as well. So I think the prospects for actual improvement in the US-China relationship are rather dim, despite the somewhat constructive tone of the Biden-Xi meeting at the G20 in October.
We have two more questions, Drew, if you allow.
Yeah,
one
please.
is from Heinrich Lanz. He is asking, how do you assess the risk of China's government using a military intervention in Taiwan as a means to divert the attention of the population away from economic and social problems?
That's a great question. Again, one of the big challenges, if all the power is consolidated in Xi Jinping's hands, it's very difficult to predict how he's going to make decisions. So that makes predictions very hard. But that said, it's not logical to me, nor do I think that there's a historical precedent in China's history that it would take a very complicated domestic situation filled with tremendous risks, structural risks, dissatisfaction of the Chinese people, what they would call contradictions amongst the people, and then compound that with creating essentially a foreign war, which would involve a fairly well-prepared Taiwan military and a US military prepared to intervene. So I think the likelihood of China starting a war with Taiwan as a distraction is low. But that said, I think Xi Jinping has very clear political objectives for achieving unification. There is no call in Taiwan for unification under the terms that China is offering. The one country, two systems proposal has been rejected by both the KMT and the DPP, the two major political parties. Essentially, there's nobody agreeing to peacefully unify with China. And that really only leaves the use of force as the only means for China to achieve that goal. Now, it can use military coercion, shows of force, demonstrations of force to prevent Taiwan from declaring independence, but I think coercion alone is insufficient to achieve unification, which is Xi Jinping's goal. But that said, it doesn't seem practical that with a declining economy, a dissatisfied population, teetering infrastructure in the healthcare sector, that China would seek to create a whole new level of complexity and challenge to manage that really would also potentially have a questionable outcome, uncertain outcome. Xi Jinping faces a tremendous risk if he starts a conflict and is unsuccessful. And then that probably is an even greater risk to the party than the organic ones he currently faces.
And a final question, Drew, if you allow, and this is maybe a more philosophical question. Can you paint a picture of Asia and China in 2030? What's the biggest change between now and then?
So, that's a good question. Everybody wants to know what's going to happen in the future. And the American baseball player once said that predicting the future is hard. Making predictions is hard, particularly about the future. And I think that's probably a truism. I know that's been attributed to other people. I like to look at future assessments as really a process of scenario development. And we're currently on a pathway with all forces and variables acting on the key players, whether that's the US government, Washington, Beijing, Singapore, Southeast Asian states, Tokyo. What are the political drivers of the current world order? What are the current factors that are pulling it apart? These are highly complex. There are potential methodologies for breaking them down, such as net assessment. But really, I like to think about things like best case, base case, worst case scenarios, looking at it specifically from the perspective of, say, a company or an individual country, right? What's the best Asia in 2030 paradigm for Singapore, for example? Is it peaceful, prosperous, developed? ASEAN is effective and functional and able to deal with challenges from within ASEAN and manage great power competition between China and the US, managing relations, and I would think that would be a best case outcome for Singapore, for example. But changes can be sudden and not be linked to a very methodical process of looking into possible alternative futures. And I think one can throw darts at low probability but high impact events that could produce the biggest changes that might be destabilizing. And whether or not that's useful is an open question. But I could see in the next 8 to 10 years some pretty dramatic changes in the region that might not be beneficial to or consistent with the existing international order. It's entirely possible that Japan loses confidence in US security commitments and develops its own nuclear device. Taiwan, similarly, under the current government, there's no love for nuclear, but they do have raw material, and they do have weapon systems, and they tried in the 1980s to develop a nuclear device. But you do have a real risk of nuclear proliferation in the region. North Korea is case in point. So I think that's a considerable potential change should US credibility decline. North Korea, anything can happen. You could have a collapse scenario. You could have an unplanned unification scenario. You could have a conflict scenario. Russia, we focus a lot on Ukraine, but Russia could also become a Pacific problem, not just a European one. Again, Xi Jinping is a potential change agent. If Xi Jinping becomes incapacitated because of health reasons without an identified heir or an agreed to succession process, there could be several potential political outcomes from that eventuality. I mean, does the Chinese Communist Party rally and kind of return to a collective leadership model similar to what we saw under Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, with relative maybe social and economic liberalization, or is one dictator replaced by another? Or perhaps most disconcertingly, what if the party ceases to function due to internal fighting? And that could lead to an extended period of chaos and regionalism, which is not unknown in Chinese history. And foreign influence might have little to no influence or impact on that at all. So, there's also potential positive outcomes. Maybe things like China and ASEAN could agree to a code of conduct in the South China Sea. And if they did that in 2030, that would be 28 years after the declaration of the conduct of parties in the South China Sea in 2002. But I mean, that might reduce tensions between Southeast Asian states and China, but would that also maybe mean that US, European, Japanese, and Australian navies could no longer transit the South China Sea without the explicit permission from China or the Southeast Asian states? I mean, that's a potential outcome in 2030 that would be highly destabilizing and problematic for the region. So I think these are potential outcomes and scenarios in 2030 that arguably are unlikely, but not impossible, and they would be very, very high impact. The other thing, I think that whether or not managing and thinking about 2030 is sort of critical is to remind oneself that China is really a part of Asia. Asia is not really a part of China. And what happens in the region is going to have an influence on China. What happens in China is going to have an influence on the rest of the region. And I think it's important to get that balance right and understand that China certainly is a major factor in the region, but it's not the sole defining one either. And that's, I think, really important perspective that one has to remember.
Right. Time is up, unfortunately. Drew, thank you very much for your brilliant insights. I think we have to do that again and again. Hopefully we can do another webinar with you next year. I think we all learned a lot about geopolitics, about the challenging developments for business. And again, one message I believe is quite clear: expect the unexpected. So Drew, I wish you all the best, and I very much look forward to seeing you in June in Singapore.
Thank you.
The next webinar is very soon. It's actually next Friday, the 9th of December. Ivo Dalga will then speak on the final end of the Pax Americana, implications for international companies. I hope to see you there. In the meantime, all the best, goodbye, and take care.